Hi everyone, welcome to this event as part of the Social Change in the Global Middle East series. I'm Jeff Green, Director of the Andrea Mitchell Center, the organization that along with our partner, the Middle East Center at Penn, is putting on this year-long series on social change in the global Middle East. What is the global Middle East? It's something that I guess our series invites consideration of. I think most basically it involves a desire to attend to the dynamic, complex, diverse Middle East region with special attention to how that region is affected by and itself affects the broader world. On the academic level, I think part of that ambition is to explore the themes of our series with an eye to not only how they relate to the Middle East region, which is our primary concern, but when possible, how they may have a significance for those situated outside of the Middle East who may not even be scholars or students of the Middle East. And I think our two distinguished speakers today who are talking to us about governance very much reflect that ambition, with Professor Anderson discussing neoliberal forms of governance and Professor Erakat discussing the idea of apartheid and questions of transcultural, transracial solidarity. Before turning things over to the main participants, I just want to thank John Gazvinian and the rest of the staff of the Middle East Center for all their outstanding leadership. I want to thank Matt Roth at the Mitchell Center and our postdoc, Nariman Amin, who's been a wonderful member of our program this year. And I want to thank the planning committee, made up of 12 individuals from across 5 universities and colleges in the Philadelphia area who planned today's event and all the events pertaining to the series. It's been a delight working with them this year. Our moderator today, HOSINE FETNI, is one of the members of the planning committee. He's a scholar of law and sociology and international relations. He's a member of Penn's faculty of sociology, and he's a legendary advisor of undergraduates in his role as assistant dean for academic advising. He teaches on such topics as law and society, law in Africa, law and social change, and the sociology of the legal profession. And I would just signal for you one of his publications, a piece called Citizenship Divided, Muslim Subjects, Arab Citizens, Democratic Dilemmas, which is a really wonderful piece and one that I think speaks directly to the topic of social change in the global Middle East in all of its complexity and variety. So thank you, HOSINE, so much for being here today, and thank you in advance for your remarks. We look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. It is very nice to see you in person. By now, I guess we all have been tired of Zoom. It's Zoom fatigue. So, as Jeff said, I'm HOSINE FETNI from the SAI's Dean's Office. Today's topic in our series on global Middle East and social change addresses the issue of governance in the MENA region from an overall perspective of good governance and how to measure it. At least from my view, it should be based on the degree to which it delivers on the promise of human rights. And when I talk about human rights, I'm talking about the 3 generations of human rights, about the first generation, political and civil rights, the second generation of human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and the third group of human rights is group rights. And this is very essential, especially as the topic of governance touches on issues of women in the Middle East, issues of minorities, and in that context, also issues of people who are under occupation. Because when we talk about group rights, we're talking also about self-determination and the respect and the promotion of the international law of human rights and humanitarian law. Okay. And thus, we are very fortunate today to have 2 prominent speakers to address some of these issues related to governance in the Middle East or in the MENA region in general. After introducing our speakers, and once they share with you their perspective on the issue of governance, we will have Q&A. So please keep your questions to the end after our speakers deliver their remarks. Now, let me just introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Anderson, is a special lecturer, and James T. Shotwell, Professor of International Relations, Emerita, at the Columbia School of International Affairs. Dr. Anderson served as a president of the American University in Cairo from 2011 to 2016. Prior to her appointment as a president, she was also the university provost until 2008. She is Dean Emerita of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, where she led the school from 1997 to 2007. Prior to her appointment as dean, she was also the chair of the Poli-Sci department at Columbia University and the director of the Middle East Institute. She also taught both at Harvard and Princeton. Her scholarly work included work on state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, on regime change and democratization in developing countries, and on social science academic research in the US and around the world. Among her books, we have State and Social Work and Social Transformation, in Tunisia and Libya, Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century. She also published numerous scholarly work in various journals and international reviews. It is a pleasure to have Professor Anderson with us today. Our second speaker is Professor NOURA ERAKAT. NOURA is a human rights attorney, an associate professor at Rutgers University, Department of Africana Studies, and the program in criminal justice. Her research interests include human rights law, international human rights, national security law, refugee law, social justice, and critical race theory. I assume you appeared on Fox News. She's the author of Justice for Some, Law, and The Question of Palestine, which won the Palestinian Book Award and other awards, also published widely in legal journals and reviews. Her current research seeks to examine the activist praxis in contemporary renewals of Black Palestinian solidarity. She also served as a legal counsel in the House of Representatives. She argued before the US federal courts on cases of war crimes. Currently, she serves on several boards. She's the co-founding editor of Jadaliyya. NOURA's activities and work is so numerous to list in this short introduction. NOURA, we are so happy to have you with us. Okay, now let's start. Professor Anderson, you go first.
All right. So what I want to do is talk about the evolution of, if you will, theories of governance or governance practices in the post-war, that is to say, post-Second World War Arab world. So I'm going to talk quickly about some historical moments, and then I'm going to talk about what I think is happening now, which obviously is of particular interest to us. Regional politics in the region, in the Arab world, is often characterized as a sort of endless game of rivalry and struggle and competition for influence. The players may vary, but the rules don't change. And what I want to argue is, in fact, the rules do change, and they have changed. Today's rivals are battling over very different stakes and deploying very different arsenals than their predecessors in either the 1950s or the 1990s. So I'm going to say there's sort of a 1950s and 60s era, then there's a 70s, 80s, 90s, and then it begins to change. So to start with that, I think the first era here, the post-independent, post-imperial years, when memories of European control were still fresh, political debates within the Arab world centered on the shape of the post-colonial order. How much of the legacy of European rule would survive? Sovereignty and statehood were prized as the symbols of autonomy and authority and agency in a world that was structured, at least in part, by a global order reflected in the new United Nations. In other words, in order to be independent, you had to be a country, and you had to be a state recognized by the United Nations. So who would exercise that sovereignty? So during most of the 50s through at least the mid-70s, these questions were debated in many forms and fora, as relationships between nations and states, governments were all contested. So I won't rehearse all of this, but you'll remember Nasser's embrace of pan-Arab nationalism, which reflected and sustained the tension between revolutionary nationalism and state sovereignty, from the toppling of European-imposed monarchs in Egypt, Iraq, Libya, the wresting of Algeria from France, the creation and dissolution of the United Arab Republic, and the repeated and failed efforts to liberate Palestine from what was widely seen as an illegitimate foreign occupation. All of that was part of what was roiling in the region at the time. Boundaries were porous, identities fluid, as pan-Arab aspirations justified interventions across state boundaries, and republics and monarchies alike pursued proxy wars in civil conflicts in Yemen and Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere. With the Arab military defeat of '67, the heady ambitions to redraw the European map of the region began to give way to more modest efforts to simply secure its borders. So all of that sort of, we can change this whole map, settled into how do we sustain our governments within the entities that were defined by those boundaries. The withdrawal of the British from their last possessions east of Suez, the independence of the small Gulf states in the early 70s, marked the end of the formal European control, and by the end of the decade, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty signaled the triumph of state interests over nationalist ambitions, at least as far as the regimes were concerned. Efforts to remake the past were finished. So now we focus for the next several decades on prolonging the present, as I put it. So over the succeeding decades, as control of territory was secured and international recognition assured, regime stability came to take precedence over state building as the principal political priority in the region. The superpowers settled into a Cold War détente, and they prized predictability over uncertainty, so they supplied client regimes with foreign and military aid that ensured policy continuity and, not unrelatedly, regime stability. So too, the availability of increased oil revenues among both the producers and their regional allies supported regime stability. So after decades of military coups, remember Syria in the 1960s, there was no regime change in the Arab world in the 30 years between the oil price increases of '73 and the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Orderly succession on the death of the ruler of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, and so forth, illustrated the investment in regime continuity. So clearly, the region itself and the international patrons of these various governments didn't want change. But, and this is my argument about what subsequently happened, this stability obscured important changes in the dynamic of regional politics, because it represented not only the surrender of earlier nationalist aspirations, but the abandonment of more conventional state formation. So this was no longer about the states and state capacity, it was about regimes, and about regimes' ability to stay in power. So they began ultimately to supplement and eventually supplant states as the focus of political loyalties. You weren't so much loyal to the state that was being built as you were loyal to the regime that was controlling the state. So these autocratic rulers, as they all were, relied not only relied not on the popular support of citizens so much as subsidies from external patrons, which they in turn used to create and sustain networks of patronage at home. Shifting from appeals to citizens, appeals that might have produced demands for greater freedom and participation, and we wouldn't have wanted that, to claims for allegiance based on ethnic and religious solidarities. So this is, by the way, an argument which I am not going to pursue, but we can, that much of the sectarianism that we see developing in the region at that time is actually produced by regimes who are looking to create solid sources of support for their own stability. This deliberate and often cynical tactic to evade accountability to a broad-based citizenry quickly escaped the control of the regimes, however, and such identities proved at least as effective in mobilizing opposition as support. So it got out of control pretty quickly, but that's how it originated. And by the 1980s, the state-based order was challenged by Islamist and sectarian mobilization as groups based on networks of religious affiliation and ethnic kinship proliferated across the region. They did two things, one of which is they did challenge these regimes to some extent, but they also provided aid and solace in communities where the state itself was weakening. So, although the state boundaries were largely immovable and regimes seemed similarly secure, ordinary people were increasingly vulnerable. So, this is, I can rehearse this, you all are undoubtedly aware of it. So conflict raged across the region, taking a major toll in human life without any discernible impact on the political regimes. The Lebanese Civil War from 75 to 90 cost an estimated 150,000 lives and the exodus of almost 1 million people from the country, but it produced no change in the regime that governed the state. Indeed, shortly after the war ended, the parliament declared amnesty for all political and wartime crimes, promoting an outcome in which there was, as they put it, no victor, no vanquished, just a lot of dead people. Similarly, after more than 8 years and as many as 1 million casualties, the Iraq-Iran War of the 1980s produced a stalemate and again, no change in regime. In 1990, the war was settled with an exchange of prisoners and a return to the status quo ante. So clearly, the global investment in stability was confirmed in the decisive rejection of the Iraqi claims on Kuwait in 1991, and less decisively in the continuing failure to address the Palestinian aspirations for statehood. The human cost of this investment in regime stability was reflected not only in war casualties and refugee counts. By the 1990s, population growth and economic stagnation had conspired to erode the gains in health, education, and employment of the preceding decades across the region. And the post-Cold War era saw little improvement as neoliberal policy prescriptions discouraged large-scale government investment in social welfare provision. By the turn of the century, the Arab world had among the lowest adult literacy rates in the world. Only 62% of the region's adults could read, well below the world average of 84%, and the developing country average of 76%. The region's economies have stagnated. Again, I could rehearse more of this, but you're probably familiar with it. The reliance on oil and the neglect of labor-intensive sectors amplified scandalously high unemployment, especially among the young. As the 21st century opened, the Middle East was becoming what Thomas Piketty and his colleagues called, quote, a pioneer region in terms of extreme inequality. Although the wealthy got wealthier, even excluding the Gulf countries, within other countries, the wealthy got wealthier. More than 2/3 of the population was living precariously by any measure in 2018. 40% of the population were classified as poor. An additional 25% were vulnerable to poverty. Just this month, the UN issued a report that said that since the onset of COVID, the rich, as of now, this was in the last 2 years, this has come to be the case, the rich control more than 80% of the wealth of the region, and the bottom half of the population saw its wealth diminished by 1/3. 6 Arab countries are among the top 20 most unequal countries. In 2019, there were only 2. So this is accelerating. This is not stopping. Now, as Rami Khouri observed, this trend seems to be directly associated with a steady recent decline in the quality of state-managed basic social services and so forth. So one of my favorite quotes, and I've used this several times in some of the writing on this era that I've done, was Anthony Cordesman, who was an analyst of military affairs in the region, who said, "It didn't matter whether the regime is ruled by a king or a sheikh or a president. It was apparent that many Middle Eastern states had no enemy greater than their own governments." So it was in this context that the uprisings broke out in 2010 and thereon. The governments were taken by surprise, itself an indication of how detached they had become from the preoccupations of their citizens, and their initial response to the popular disturbances was confused, as you obviously saw. Many governments and some of their opponents resorted to what was then, by then, and this is, I will make this case, and we can discuss this later, the by then tired reliance on sectarianism to frame expressions of popular discontent despite its irrelevance to the calls for bread, freedom, dignity, and justice. That's what those were about. But everybody said, oh no, it's about the Muslim Brotherhood, or so forth and so on. So within a few years, most of the efforts to capture popular support by reference to early nationalist commitments or religious and sectarian loyalties had been abandoned, and governments were struggling to regain the upper hand in battles with their own people. At that point, a new emphasis appeared, and this is what I think is happening now. This was a product of the previous decades of both neoliberal hostility to the state and growing disenchantment with profligate regimes. This is a model where the polity is a business enterprise. Power will no longer be measured by chanting crowds or soldiers under arms. The revolutionary nationalists and patronage dispensing co-religionists were giving way to the business leader promising customer service and shareholder value. So, Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, wrote in his autobiography, "Today's leaders are not the same as yesterday's. Today's leaders are the silent giants who possess money, not the politicians who make the noise. The babble of politics and its messy entanglements are of little benefit to us in the Arab world." So, throw down the gauntlet here. This is a new definition of what the relationship between a government and its citizens ought to be. As the decade after the Arab uprisings wore on, the messy entanglements of regional politics were being sorted out. The triumph of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was quickly reversed as the UAE and Saudi Arabia supported the installation of a new military regime. The temptations to prolong sectarian mobilization within the region, represented principally by the Qataris and Turkish supportive groups affiliated with the Brotherhood, were firmly and decisively resisted. And I would argue, in 2020, in a spectacular indication that neither nationalist pride nor religious allegiance would define the new political landscape, the UAE and Israel signed what are known as the Abraham Accords, about which I will talk a little bit more shortly. But clearly, economic cooperation, tourism, foreign investment, especially in technology, including artificial intelligence and defense production, soon followed. This is business. This is a business arrangement, and that's what governments are supposed to be about. So what was the logic of this emerging regional dynamic? The neoliberal foundations of globalization are presented as a new opportunity to reframe state-society relations, bypassing both states and regimes, the babble of politics, for an entirely new notion of governance modeled on the modern multinational corporation. As Al Maktoum, himself a prominent advocate of this approach, obviously, argued, maybe the time has come for the GCC or the Arab League to be overseen by leaders, managers, businessmen, heads of industry, and entrepreneurs instead of foreign ministers. The ruling families of the Gulf were obviously among the most eager proponents of this retreat of the state and the restructuring of regimes, as they adopted the watchwords of the global private sector, positioning their countries as flexible, adaptive, entrepreneurial, innovative. They characterized themselves as less as stewards of states or members of political regimes than of management committees of family-owned businesses. Indeed, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was soon called the CEO of Al Saud Incorporated, having taken control of Aramco, and he quickly became deeply entwined with the fabric of global financial systems. So we can talk about that more. He is the major investor in the $100 billion Vision Fund. And of course, Mohammed bin Rashid in Dubai calls himself the CEO of Dubai. But the Gulf rulers, I would argue, are hardly alone in accenting finance, entrepreneurship, and investment. Many governments are seizing the initiative to drive economic investment that they had once left to their crony capitalist allies, including a number of what were conventionally understood as military regimes. In 2020, Algeria's government, for example, announced that foreign investors could take majority stakes in projects in a variety of sectors at home and started developing the Algiers Stock Exchange. Many of the countries of the region also manage sovereign wealth funds, which are an important mechanism by which these countries make money when they're not making money from other kinds of rents. Among the world's top 50 sovereign wealth funds, 12 are in the Middle East, including Egypt's at number 43. These funds invested in projects designed to generate, or were said to have been designed to generate domestic growth and employment, but mostly to partner with international private funds that typically make investments much riskier than the kinds of investments that generate growth and development, such as technology firms, entertainment companies, real estate projects, as befit funds responsible not to citizens but to shareholders. Other ways to attract private investment were proliferating as well, various kinds of exceptional jurisdictions, and I would really like the lawyers here to weigh in on this. The exceptional jurisdictions and privatized enclaves operating under special legal regimes, profiting from and protecting their investors, appeared across the region. From special economic zones and self-contained techno-cities and science parks, gated residential communities and offshore cruise ships, labor compounds and private islands, these enclaves provided a regional and even global class of wealthy entrepreneurs with bespoke legal regimes, including not only tax exemptions, but dispute arbitration rather than the jurisdiction of national courts, and private security in lieu of local police. The role of the shareholder was increasingly complicated and even supplanting rights-based claims on governments. This citizen as economic actor may have been born in the Gulf, but as I suggested, it was also trans-regional. Where there was foreign investment, there were local partners, agents, and representatives looking for shares of the wealth, and governments prepared to accommodate them. When protests against the law granting amnesty to corrupt civil servants broke out in Tunisia in 2017, what Nadia Marzouki called a shift from transitional to transactional justice produced a law that the then president argued was necessary to restore the confidence to bring back investors after the upheavals of the uprisings earlier in the decade. So a couple of more observations and then I will have concluded. For those who were the beneficiaries of such arrangements, the rights of citizenship are superseded by the privileges conveyed by patronage and protection in private systems of governance that are often inconsistent with, even contrary to, national law. This disregard for local law permitted the growth of what might be called an archipelago of enclaves stretching across the region that knit together transnational networks of special financing, exclusive investment opportunities, commercial security firms, isolated airports, cloistered villas, and private meetings. Although Saudi Arabia had ambitious plans for Riyadh, one of the most dramatic efforts to create a new investment-ready government enclave was Egypt's new administrative capital, and we can talk about that in more detail. But from the vantage point of the denizens of these kinds of gated communities with private security and special jurisdiction, the purpose of government had shifted from securing independence or safeguarding stability to ensuring the ease of doing business. In the 21st century, the purpose of government was fast becoming facilitating the captains of industry and finance to fly from enclave to enclave, making deals and securing licenses and visiting theme parks. In this context, establishing relations with Israel was merely a smart business arrangement. The Jewish state was understood as neither a nationalist settler colony nor a sectarian regime, but a business-friendly enclave of technology transfer, investment financing, and technological innovation. Now, as I suggested, the appeal of this approach to governance was considerable for the beneficiaries. It shared the techno-optimism of Silicon Valley, where companies from Facebook to Amazon transformed social life by making communication and commerce easier and more convenient, all the while creating vast invisible stores of surveillance data and fast-growing disparities in wealth. But I think it's pretty clear that this is what the intent of this new reconfiguring of the region. The Israeli foreign minister said about the conference that just finished, "What we are doing here is making history, building a new regional architecture based on progress, technology, religious tolerance, security, and intelligence cooperation that intimidates and deters our common enemies." All right. The visionaries understood both sides of the coin they were tendering. Maktoum's first rule of leadership, he provides a list of rules of leadership at the end of his autobiography, was that processes, laws, and systems are to serve the people and make their lives easier and more comfortable, which is hardly a clarion call for freedom or social justice, but appealing in a context, perhaps, of decades of frustration and disappointment. But he reminds his reader that because that's what laws and systems are about, they can be changed at any time. These rulers are not subject to the rule of law, nor accountable to citizens. They prefer consultants to voters, marketing to campaigning, and customers to citizens. The designers and promoters and beneficiaries of this are optimists. Yusuf Otaiba, the UAE's long-serving ambassador in Washington, put it, "What I've watched over the last several years is a shift in mindset, a shift in attitude. Younger people are tired of conflict. They're tired of ideology. They want solutions. They want jobs. They want what every young person in the world wants. We're trying to approach long-standing issues with a completely different lens, essentially going from analog to digital." That's the optimistic side. The challenge to this model of governance was the question of what will happen to those in the interstices, outside the enclaves. There are millions of people in southern Tunisia, across Libya and Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, not to say all Palestinians, who are left out, neglected by these new regimes, abandoned to fight over the remnants of older political loyalties, presumably nursing envy and grievance. And even those within the countries whose rulers are embracing the business-friendly future, there were those who saw themselves left behind. As Khalid Fahmy, the historian, wrote of the Egyptian capital, new administrative capital, assuming that the aim of building a new administrative capital is to alleviate the pressure from downtown Cairo, where the majority of government offices are located, and assuming, for argument's sake, that the 5 million inhabitants will actually be moved from the overcrowded city, what will happen to the rest of us? And that's really the kind of crux of the matter. The rest of us in the region have reason to worry. Companies solicitous of their shareholders, concerned about their customers, even willing to care for their employees, are not accountable to people who don't buy their shares, purchase their products, or produce their goods. In a world of competing business enterprises, who is responsible for the public interest? So let me just conclude by suggesting that Lebanon suggests a salutary, if disquieting, warning. After the end of the Civil War, the Lebanese political elite, like many of its counterparts elsewhere in the region, used a mixture of sectarian identity politics and patronage to secure support. But the merger of business and politics was evident early in the role of Prime Minister Rafik Hariri's construction company in the reconstruction of Beirut. As the International Crisis Group put it later, in reality, these leaders were mostly serving themselves. They have amassed considerable wealth in the post-war era. In the process, they neglected economic development and helped ruin the country's finances. Lebanon's humanitarian catastrophe has been kept at bay by remittances sent by millions of Lebanese living abroad, a private solution to a very public calamity. Might other private solutions to the challenge of providing public goods be found? Perhaps, but in the absence of governments that see themselves as more than investors, responsible to citizens above shareholders, promoting constituents over customers, it is what is for some a tantalizing dream of opportunities is probably a daunting vision of bleak prospects for those left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you to the Middle East Center. Thank you to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the study of democracy. I apologize for my struggling voice, but thanks to the mics as well. A few caveats in addition before beginning. I just want to acknowledge, not in a salutary way, but in a sincere way, my role and structure here as a settler on these lands, on these Creek, Seminole lands. I do believe that decolonization is real. I believe that it's practical. We have seen in the United States several measures to give the land back, and I believe that that's still feasible and something that we all struggle for. I also want to personally thank Matt for his tender and very careful care in organizing this event and dealing with the frustrations that I've presented. Thank you for that. And a special thank you to Ibrahim, who has spoiled my daughter, not only with her favorite bag of chips, but with several bags of chips that she is going at because I cannot reach her. Okay. My comments will actually not necessarily address transnational solidarities, although I'm very happy to address that in the discussion and the Q&As. It'll come up implicitly. I also hope to be able to be in conversation with you, Dr. Anderson, especially about this provocative idea of who then are these regimes accountable to. Indeed, they are beholden to the external funders and providers of capital as well as to business. But in addition, one thing that I was thinking about is that, for example, the Abraham Accords in particular were not merely a good business deal, but an ability to be able to expand their hold on repressive technologies, military and carceral, that are meant to suppress democracy in order to fulfill and expand these capitalist interests at the expense of all peoples, not merely the Palestinians who were the byproduct of this. On June 26th, 2021, 35-year-old journalist and mother of two, Najla Zaytoun, was attacked by plainclothes policemen as she covered protests in Ramallah. The security personnel chased down Najla, seized her phone, with which she was filming, and beat her with a club. She explains, quote, "A person wearing plain clothes threatened me to my face that he would rape me and then defame my reputation," end quote. Sadly, Najla's experience was emblematic of the experience of women protesters in the summer 2021. Worse, her assailants in this case were Palestinian security forces. The context in which this occurred was the protest that took place 2 days after the kidnapping and assassination of Nizar al-Bannat, a Palestinian journalist who had been a longtime critic of the Palestinian Authority. At the time, he was covering the PA's dismal provision of COVID vaccinations. The protests that erupted on the heels of one of the most powerful and momentous summers, moments, junctures in Palestinian history that we've come to know as the Unity Intifada. The Palestinian street was already mobilized and ready to mobilize against the Palestinian Authority as well. Last summer, we witnessed what was a spark in Sheikh Jarrah an East Jerusalem suburb that has been marked for ethnic cleansing and Palestinian removal in order to be replaced with Jewish Israelis, which is covered and captured in a Jerusalem municipal plan that is regarded as a simple administrative document. Literally, this document enshrines this policy of ethnic cleansing, and yet we have difficulty using that language because it's quote-unquote controversial. And yet it's enshrined as outstanding policy. Palestinians recognize this moment as a microcosm of their broader condition that they describe as the ongoing Nakba, that begins within the state, that has marked Palestinians for removal, including the Palestinian citizens of Israel. As we know, in the momentous protests that have taken place, including on Land Day, March 30th, 1976, just yesterday, marked the 46th anniversary of this event, when Palestinian citizens, who upon Israel's establishment first excluded from citizenship, but then recognized as citizens, were governed by what we describe in law as an exceptional regime, as an emergency regime derived directly from British colonial rule, used to suspend civilian government in order to rule by martial, an extraordinary law what the British Empire had used to quell protests and uprisings from Malay to Kenya, Jamaica, India, and Palestine. In this case, it was applied to the Palestinians that remained with the explicit intent to remove them from their home by limiting their movement, prohibiting their freedom of speech, shutting down the freedom of press, by declaring their lands as firing zones, by forcibly removing them, by preventing their family unification, all the things that you may be familiar with as endemic to the governance of the West Bank under military occupation was the law that governed the Palestinians who remained from 1948 to 1966. It was within this context that those Palestinians rose up to protest the confiscation of their lands, because Israel's first settlements are not the settlements that we know in the West Bank and for some time in the Gaza Strip, but were the 350 settlements established within the state itself. Upon review of this emergency regime, when the military government explained that these Palestinian citizens no longer didn't even pose a threat to the nascent, the young Israeli state, Ben-Gurion replied that the military law, that the emergency regime was in place for the explicit purpose of territorial expansion. So to understand that when we discuss these processes, when we discuss the condition of settler colonialism, or what many have become more familiar with as apartheid, that this doesn't begin at the false partition of the Green Line, but begins within Israel itself, and marks all Palestinians for removal, regardless of juridical or geographic demarcation. This is what animates the May through June Unity Intifada. This is what catalyzes this organic movement of Palestinians in Ramallah, of Palestinians in Jerusalem, of Palestinians in Al-Lid, of Palestinians in Haifa, of Palestinians in Gaza, of Palestinians in Philadelphia, to unite with a singular voice, to affirm once again that they are a single nation targeted with a single policy by a settler sovereign, seeking to remove them in order to suspend the critique and the protest of Zionist settler sovereignty. It was remarkable, not least of which because it was not mobilized even by one iota by an official leadership. The Palestinian leadership had nothing to do with it. In fact, were it to be involved, it might have tried to quell the protests, but it could not. These protests happen organically, without a central leadership, without a media coordinator. Even though if you listen to all those who spoke or wrote in this moment, it was as if there was some sort of talking point document, and yet there wasn't. This is the work of generations of activism, of community work, of that latent threat that underlies these oppressive and seemingly infallible regimes. Absolutely no funding and no coordination, and precisely why they threatened the Palestinian Authority so much. Many analysts argue that the Palestinian Authority kidnapped and assassinated Nizar al-Bannat precisely for this reason, in order to be able to demonstrate their oppressive power, that despite what popular will may exist, despite what organic power may exist, that the arms and the ability to harm remained concentrated in the hands of the Palestinian Authority. In a webinar sponsored by the Adala Justice Project yesterday titled "Gaza is Palestine," unfortunately a necessary refrain because we've isolated and separated Gaza from the rest of the question of Palestine and deployed a harmful discourse that's collapsed it as synonymous with a political movement, and that's being generous on my part. But in commemoration yesterday of Land Day, Maryam Barghouti, a journalist, an independent journalist and an activist, explained that the Palestinian Authority represents a police state without a state. It's the worst of all these conditions that Dr. Anderson is describing, without even the benefit of the state, without the benefit of citizenship, without the benefit of some freedom of movement, without the benefit of some opportunity, but yet all the features of an oppressive regime. More, it's that the current configuration of the Palestinian Authority is not an unintended consequence of a peace process unrealized, but precisely the purpose of the Oslo peace process, which stipulated the creation of the Palestinian Authority to be an interim government that would stand for 5 years as part of the interim peace process before the final status negotiations. And yet instead, when the PA, when it was stipulated as such, the purpose of it was administrative. The PA would pick up garbage, deliver mail, administer local municipal functions, but never have the sovereignty of a state, never have a military, never have jurisdiction over people and the lands upon which they live, never have authority over border or even citizenship. Within the Declaration of Principles and the Oslo II that follows in 1995 and the series of documents that follow that constitute the peace process, there is not one mention of a Palestinian state. The idea that the Oslo failed to produce a state is a myth. It's a fallacy. Oslo was never supposed to produce a state. Oslo stipulates the creation of an autonomy framework. It is a form of derivative sovereignty. It is a form whereby Palestinians would have authority over some peoples, but over none of the lands of those peoples. The first Israeli leader who intimates that there would be a Palestinian state was Ehud Barak in the year 2000. And even in that articulation, it was a mutilated state that still would have no features of sovereignty that the Arabs and other peoples so coveted during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s at the apex of Third World revolt. And in fact, Palestinian leaders themselves agree that it never stipulated that a state would be created, but agreed to it nevertheless, quote, on faith. On faith that the fall of the Soviet Union, that the end of the Cold War, it wasn't the fall of the Soviet Union, excuse me, the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid in Namibia, the first and free elections of Nelson Mandela, the first black leader in South Africa, that at this moment, the ascendance of the Clinton administration, that all of these things were so promising that someone would certainly deliver them the state. And yet we obviously have now several decades of empirical and damning evidence to the contrary, and yet a Palestinian Authority nonetheless wedded to these conditions. At the collapse of the Camp David talks in 2000, approximately 9,000 lightly armed Palestinian security forces turned those arms on Israelis. Right? This was the Frankenstein that Israel and the United States created when they established the peace process and the PA and consolidated the use of violence amongst the Palestinian Authority with the specific intent that Palestinian security forces would protect Israel's interests, would protect settlers, and would protect its settler infrastructure in the occupied territories. In 2000, those lightly armed security forces turned their arms onto Israeli forces themselves, beginning what we know as the Second Palestinian Intifada, which was a militarized form of the Intifada and far less democratic than its earlier iteration in the late 1980s. In response, and at its close in 2005, not only did we see Israel shift from a framework of occupation to a framework of outright warfare, which I'm happy to discuss in legal technologies that they used, in order to do so because Israel has taken every step in the language of law. It's not merely the hubris of power, but in fact, it is a specific legal technology that enables it to use force against the Palestinians in the territory which Israel occupies, over whom they have the responsibility to protect. Israel shifts from this framework of occupation to warfare, which plants the deadly seeds for the wars we see in Gaza to the present day. At the same time, the Palestinian security forces are disciplined, and they're disciplined in the presence of Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, who then trains those Palestinian forces to better protect Israel and its interests and to turn their force against the Palestinians themselves. Obviously, they did a wonderful job last summer. Today, the Palestinian security services constitute 44% of the public sector and account for 30 to 45% of the entire Palestinian national budget. Half of the Palestinian national budget, Palestinians which are struggling to be on their lands, Palestinians which need access to water, to better wells, Palestinians that could be organized, Palestinian families who could be supported, who could be educated, half of the national budget is spent on security forces. 2% of that budget is spent on agriculture. 64% of Palestinians want the Palestinian Authority to end its security cooperation with Israel, but it does not. Why not? One of the reasons is because Israel remains in ultimate control of the Palestinian Authority, even in the face of slight protest, and we've seen slight protest. We've seen slight protests against de jure annexation. We've seen slight protests by the bid at the International Criminal Court. I think it's very weak. I think it's insufficient and anemic. But in response to that, Israel has withheld Palestinian taxes, and only upon the capitulation of the Palestinian leadership did Israel release those funds, approximately $1 billion last year, which constitutes half of the entire Palestinian national budget. So you can imagine, resistance for the leadership is quite difficult, if not structurally impossible. Aside from these structural conditions is the very fact that I believe that this leadership lacks a visionary imagination. Palestinians have had at least two serious opportunities to establish the state, once in 1947 at the presentation of the partition plan, which they reject, all Arabs rejected, again in the heyday of Third World Revolt, where this entire movement eclipses them and leaves them behind. I would say that the third time was at the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of apartheid in Southern Africa. These were all serious moments of opportunity and hope, whereby the Palestinian state could have been reached, could have been established, but that opportunity overcame them. At this point, and at least since the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, when Yasser Arafat was besieged in the presidential compound and it ultimately killed, I think the peace process was dead then. More critical analysts would argue, like Edward Said, prominent scholar, public intellectual, also at Columbia, would have argued that it was dead upon birth, because Oslo in itself, in the documents themselves, as I intimated, never proposed the establishment of a state, but instead proposed the situation we have today. The lack of vision is the inability to think beyond the state. For most Palestinians, their horizon is to be at least as unlucky as the other Arab regimes, at least as beholden to them and less accountable to their peoples, but not an imagination that would enable them to transcend these strictures of sovereignty, which I think current popular movements are actually forcing us to think about. Here on these lands, in Hawaii, across Black communities in the United States who are showing us the bankruptcy of equality, who are demonstrating for us how citizenship models are actually structures of domination as well. That this is a moment to exercise a public imagination and to usher us into a new era. But the Palestinian lacks that vision. And the third, of course, is because the Palestinian leadership is enriched very much by these structures. And since entering the United States and Israeli sphere of influence, has acquired and adopted a politics of acquiescence. And this faithfulness, that the more that they acquiesce rather than resist to Israeli and US demands, the closer they'll get to receiving the state which the United States will deliver to them. Right? So this is what, for me, explains why, for example, the Palestinian leadership refused to press for the recommendations of the Goldstone report, which was conducted after the 2008-2009 invasion, aerial and ground offensive against the Gaza Strip and its besieged population. They rescinded those findings from the Human Rights Council. It's why the Palestinian leadership has refused to pursue accountability after the 2004 International Court of Justice decision, which actually proposes sanctions upon Israel. Here you have an international tribunal which proposes that third parties are complicit with war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Palestinian leadership could have run with across diplomatic capitals, but did not. They also refused to expel Israel from FIFA when they had the opportunity, and have yet to endorse boycott and divestment and sanctions. Instead, they've become a part of Israel's regime to actually control Palestinians. And these conditions of oppression are not only manifest in the security coordination that I've described to you, but also manifest in surveillance. In 2018, Human Rights Watch released a report documenting the egregious abuses of the Palestinian Authority in imprisoning Palestinians for their social media posts. The judiciary, the lack of independence of the judiciary. In July 2019, Mahmoud Abbas dissolved the High Judicial Council, reduced the retirement age to 60 in order to establish a more favorable judiciary. At the time, 14 out of 27 justices resigned in protest, and the separate constitutional court was stacked with 9 Fatah loyalists. Perhaps most notoriously of all, of course, is the lack of democratic elections. Presidential and legislative elections have only occurred twice, once in 1996 and another time in 2005 and 2006. Those elections, if you recall, resulted in the parliamentary victory of Hamas and later the preemptive coup in Gaza, where Hamas routed Fatah, backed by the United States and Israel, that has led to now an outstanding internecine Palestinian political conflict. The US and Abbas has since ruled by decree, and the entirety of the 365 square kilometer coastal enclave of Gaza remains under a debilitating land siege, naval blockade, sanctions, in what might be the most grotesque forms of a biopolitical regime that we know today, and yet fail to address, I would say, because we're trained through racial and colonial discourse to expect these Palestinians not to matter. So the significant point here is the context. I've spent all my time emphasizing the role of the Palestinian Authority, pointing fingers where they're due, taking responsibility for our own community, but we cannot have this discussion without taking into account the context. And the context is that this authority was created to serve a particular function, and they are doing a wonderful job at serving that function. They have made Palestinian liberation even more difficult and beyond reach. And this authority, the irony of all this, is that the authority that has produced this outcome is what has been now increasingly recognized as an apartheid regime. As you may know, in 2021, 2 Israeli organizations, Beit Salem and then Yesh Din, came to this conclusion, and then Human Rights Watch followed. This year, Amnesty International, and most recently, the UN Special Rapporteur to the occupied Palestinian territories, Michael Link, came to the same conclusion. But these recent findings are built on multiple other findings, including the 2012, when the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination found that Israel was in violation of Article 3 of the Convention to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination, which is tantamount to apartheid and segregation. Also in 2017, the UN ESQA came to the same conclusion, though they were forced to shelve that report and the director resigned in protest. And of course, all of that builds on the Palestinian intellectual production and political advocacy beginning as early as 1965 in the works of Palestinian scholar Fayez Sayegh, who developed a racial theory of Zionism as a form of racial elimination, in contrast to other forms of European colonization which were predicated on racial domination. He would later go on to lead the efforts to pass Resolution 3379 at the General Assembly, concluding Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination in 1975. That resolution, the PLO rescinded in 1991 as a precondition for entering into Oslo. Notably, none of the reports that have been released grapple with Zionism, and they do not grapple with race. If anything, if you read the Beit Selem report, they conclude that there is apartheid without racism. They describe it as, they distinguish it from South Africa, where it was based on race and color, versus in Israel, where it's based on religion and nationality, even if for the sake of upholding Jewish superiority. It's a very odd conclusion. I'm very happy to talk about why they come to that conclusion and how some of those findings are actually rooted in the very abstract and non-conclusive definitions of race and racism in international law, not least of which captured in the ICERD, or the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But the point that they do not grapple with Zionism or with any racial theories is because these reports advocate that Israel should then the antidote to Israeli apartheid is through legislative reform, suggesting that this is about governance rather than about ideology. And yet what Palestinians have been emphasizing is that this is not about a democratic order only, but this is about decolonization and an unfinished program of decolonization. And lest we fetishize the Arab world for its lack of democracy, it's important to zoom out, as I am right now, to think about Israeli apartheid and it's the US as its imperial patron in order to sustain it, right? This isn't an Arab problem. It's not that Arabs can't govern themselves. Obviously, there are vested interests that are entwined in regional and international politics, not least of which decades of US intervention in pursuit of its national interests that have shaped these current realities of state violence, lack of democracy, and unfreedom. I still, despite these dismal conditions, have tremendous faith in people. The last summer and the Unity Intifada is an indication of that. The Arab uprisings are an indication of that. More, our histories of protest are an indication of that, and an infallible thirst and drive for freedom, which we continue to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. Thank you, Professor Anderson. I just want to make my questions very quick. I only have a couple of questions. I have more, but I would rather that you ask the questions. My first would be to Dr. Anderson, and I think talking about these changing dynamics within the region, especially when it comes to the Gulf countries, and how these new dynamics have shaped the relationship that exists between these countries, and let's say that led to the signing of the Abraham Accord. There is no question that Israel has the technology, has the economic power that they could benefit from, but really some would really argue, and I would argue that it is really not because these countries really need the economics and the technology, but their emphasis was really more about security. And that's why, in a sense, when you look at the UAE, what about the issue that they have with Iran regarding the two islands, the Abu Musa Island and the Grander and Lesser Thomas Island? You talk about Bahrain, a Sunni minority, totally abusing and exploiting and committing horrible crimes against the majority Shiites. You talk about Morocco, for instance, joined the Abraham Accord in exchange for US recognition of the Western Sahara. Sudan, well, poor Sudan, what they have a boycott imposed on them, they have sanctions, so that is really another issue. So it's not really just the welfare state here, but the other paradigm of security, the security paradigm, is probably what really led to these changes in the dynamics. Now, Noura, as someone who lived through the Algerian revolutions, I can really understand, the plight of the Palestinian, because I was a kid. We used to go through roadblocks and we were chased, so I understand the reality that the Palestinians are going through. And when you talk about the Palestinian Authority, it is really not more corrupt than any of the Arab regimes. I think the question that people really now would like really to ask, and I would like you to explain to the audience, is why do we have the argument that for the Palestinian to benefit from all these international protection of humanitarian law and the international human rights, they have to have a state. And since they do not exist, the state of Palestine does not exist, then therefore they cannot, for instance, under international law profess certain rights. For instance, you find here people who argue that, well, Israel has a right to self-defense when they go to Gaza because the United States has the right to its self-defense when the World Trade Center was attacked. So in a sense, there is that equation, and it all has to do with that the Palestinians do not have a state, and therefore they cannot argue for the use of this humanitarian law, which includes the Hague Regulation as well as the 4 Geneva Conventions. Would you please explain that legal ramification for that argument, and why, in my opinion, it's not really a good argument?
Clarify that. So Palestinians don't have recourse to international law because they don't have a state?
That's it, yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, very quickly, I don't want to underplay the importance of security, but to some extent, I try and capture that when I talk about these governments seeing themselves as enclaves. So they are threatened, but what are they threatened by? Right now, they're going to say, oh, they're threatened by Iran, or they're threatened by, Hezbollah or something like that. But what they are is really enormous gated communities that they all, so to some extent that is partly about living a privileged life and seeing some of the threats as threatening that privileged life. So if I were them, I would be trying to appeal to the United States by talking about this in geopolitical terms. But in fact, I think much of it is conceptualized as, we have to make sure that we are controlling our foreign workers in the small Gulf countries. We have to make sure we're controlling the populations in Palestine. This is about controlling what would threaten our enclave. So I think so what I'm trying to do is sort of peel away some of the rhetoric about this being a security alliance and so forth and so on, and say, well, yes, but what's being secured? This is not, what's being secured is not the national interest, or even in some respects the stability of what's being secured is the privilege of the ruling group. So, so yes, of course, guaranteeing that entails security cooperation, without a doubt. And in that respect, I completely agree that when I say this is a business deal, the Abraham Accords, it's a business deal around security cooperation. These are some of the most assertive purveyors of fancy, digital security arrangements and so forth and so on. But that's, to me, the way they're conceptualizing what they're doing.
Thank you.
So I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to build on it a little bit. So the question is about the role of states in international law and access to certain protections. And this actually was something that Hannah Arendt pointed out in witnessing the denationalization of Jewish people, and then using high weapons technologies within Europe's borders to systematically or attempt to annihilate them, is that the most vulnerable state of being is to be human, right? So it's almost a contradiction to say that there's something called human rights, because they do not belong to humans. They actually belong to states, and they can be triggered as such. So I do understand that, and this is why refugees are so vulnerable. They have no one to appeal to and to protect them, especially stateless peoples who have become stateless, for example, in the Sudan, or certainly Palestinians, which is the largest population of stateless population, or the Badoon in Kuwait. Their condition is one that's so difficult to overcome precisely because they do not have a state to represent them. So that's just on the first point about that relationship, and it reflects the development of human rights law as basically something that was iteratively developed and incrementally in the face of atrocity and shortcoming, which is also the story of the laws of war. And so here shifting, well, what does this have to do with Palestinians, and how can they access these? How can they access the International Criminal Court? How can they access these other venues? They can't unless there's a state. That's why it takes almost 10 years for the International Criminal Court to recognize that Palestinians have jurisdiction. And it's only recognized when the General Assembly recognizes Palestine as a state in 2012. And even after that determination, it took another 5 years, which should have been very plain. So that too is relevant. But it isn't a complete block, right? And I think what you may be referring to is one of Israel's most long-standing and effective arguments, which is its argument about the missing reversioner. Was that right? Did I get that? So the missing reversioner argument, I guess, is a brilliant, but as most legal arguments may be, very gross and cynical argument that Yehuda Zvi Blum, a Hebrew University law professor who becomes Moshe Dayan's ambassador to the United Nations upon the ascent of the Likud government in Israel, forwards, and which actually is controlling, in that there can be no de jure occupation where there was not a sovereign. And so the argument was that because Gaza was not under Egyptian sovereignty, nobody claimed that it was, and that nobody recognized Jordanian sovereignty over the West Bank except for Britain and Pakistan, that therefore there was no sovereign in the territories to whom to return the territory, as stipulated by occupation law. Now, of course, what Blum completely disregards, and very deliberately, is that sovereignty vested in the Palestinian people, right? And it vested in the Palestinian people, and you can demonstrate that through a number of laws. I don't need to bore you with them, but I can make the argument, many people can make the argument. But what ended up, the thing that we need to highlight is that even assuming that there was no sovereignty vested in the Palestinian people, the advent of the Geneva Conventions, which are legislated in the aftermath of the tragedy of the Second World War and build on the shortcomings of the Hague Regulations drafted in 1907 in order to regulate means and methods of warfare, the Geneva Convention fills the lacuna, right, of who protects the civilians. Who protects the civilians? And that was filled specifically through the Fourth Geneva Convention, and was a direct response to Nazi attempts to occupy other European lands, and specifically to initiate their settler colonial establishment. And so there is, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the law that provides that civilians have rights, even if they were not sovereign, but even that argument is empty. Now here's my commentary on all of that. which is to say, this is what drives Palestinians for statehood, right? It's the civilizational framework that you could not be equal unless you were sovereign, and that sovereignty was in the form of a nation state, which is what animates anti-colonialism, anti-imperial struggle for so many decades. And yet what is clear is that sovereignty is insufficient. We see that sovereignty is insufficient to protect against Western racism, as was the case with Ethiopia, which is recognized as a sovereign in 1936, but for whom the League of Nations failed to mobilize to protect them against Mussolini's invasion at the time. We see again the fallacy of sovereignty to protect Palestinians, even now when the General Assembly has recognized them as a state. And why I think Palestinians have been caught up in a sovereignty trap, what I describe as a sovereignty trap anyway, whereby in the desire to be recognized as a juridical people with the right to self-determination, Palestinians have now trapped themselves in forever proving their eligibility for sovereignty. The only party that can determine their eligibility is in fact their settler sovereign, who makes the decision on their eligibility on how well they perform to protect it and its interests. And in exchange, all they receive is incremental freedom, which isn't tantamount ever to actual freedom.
And unfortunately, this, when we talk about discrimination, it even extends to the Israeli Palestinians, and I'm sure all you're familiar with the new law, the new citizen law, that in a sense make it difficult for a Palestinian who is an Israeli to have a spouse from Gaza or the West Bank or from any Arab country perceived to be enemy of Israel, which is by its dimension, by arguing in terms of security, then I'm going to deprive you of your civil rights. It just does not make sense. And add to that, when we talk about, we're talking really more about international collective punishment, torture, and all those things are in total violation of international law that are practiced daily against the Palestinians.
Yes and no.
Please.
Thank you, everyone, for the event and for the really stimulating presentation. I've got a question that actually is for both of you, but it starts with what Noura just was talking about and made reference to. It seems that the real solution for you to almost every problem is decolonization. Certainly the Palestine problem. But I'm wondering whether it's really decolonization or what gets built after decolonization that is the solution. And you blame or you hold the PA to account for not having the imagination to be able to portray what would come after decolonization. Lisa has given us one pretty ugly picture of what an alternative to sovereignty would be, namely rule by multinational corporations and neoliberal fascists. So I'm puzzled by two things. I've always been puzzled by what is meant currently by decolonization. For example, does England have to be decolonized because it mastered Northumbria? Does or does it have to be decolonized because it's from Norman rule as a result of the 1060 Anglo-Saxons? It's not clear what it means, how we decide which one is colonized and which one isn't. But I'm completely at a loss to understand what comes after that. That is, I really want to know, you implied you have some ideas about an alternative to a world divided into sovereign states where equal citizenship gets expressed and enjoyed. Now, we obviously don't have that in most places, but you have an alternative to it that's not Lisa's.
Do you?
Please.
So I want to point out here that one of the things that often gets placed, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Ian, but I do want to point out this dynamic, that one of the ways that Palestinians are often quieted is for their failure to have the solution and the silver bullet to solve all the world's problems. right? Or to have a blueprint for what that can even look like and how you lead to it. Unfortunately, Palestinians don't have that solution, neither do any peoples, right? Even in the course of Black uprisings, one of the most common refrain in response to Black protesters is, what do you want? What do you want? Even though it was very clear what Black protesters were trying to produce, which was a decolonial alternative, where they weren't governed through a white supremacist logic that continues to be the central organizing logic of the United States. Institutions never dismantled that logic or created a new constitutional order or reimagined who was included in the social contract of the United States by its inception. Land wasn't given back. Reparations were not initiated. And so when now Black protesters argue, let us give you a vision called abolition, because that is a project. Abolition is a project, but it's also, in the words of my colleague, Dr. Mari Morales Williams, would describe as an experiment. We may not know, but we do know that the alternative to actually extracting wealth and then using carceral and military technologies to protect its concentration of those who now hoard it should be in its redistribution and should be manifest in the conditions that would make prisons obsolete and would make the police state obsolete. It is an absolute experiment. It is not a blueprint, even though that there are several organizations who are working on it. So similarly, Palestinians are engaging in an experiment. And they are doing it with their lives, and they are doing it with their times. We're seeing it in the Palestinians as they're recreating seed libraries to know the history of their land. We're seeing it in the way that they're creating alliances with other peoples who have not been recognized. We're seeing it in the way that they're taking themselves off the grid to practice what has been popularized as mutual aid, but which sustained and has sustained Palestinian communities because they've never had a state that provides for them. All of these things are real, they're not fancy. And so I want to push back at the suggestion that I believe decolonization is the answer to everything. Absolutely not. Not least of which because I don't believe in any totalizing analytical framework, but also because that would not be apt. But in the case of Palestinians, it absolutely is. And so it looks like that. It looks like turning away from the settler sovereign for recognition, from the imperial patron for the provision of a state, in order to actually create the conditions to care for one another. It looks like slowing down to be able to care for one another. It looks like actually caring for the land, and not just wanting the land as a privatized commodity, but wanting to be in relationship to that land and what it provides. And this sounds odd, we're here, but Nick Estes has captured this very well in his book, The History is the Future, as he documents the Dakota Access Pipeline battle. And what he points us to is that in fact, our future is a return to those indigenous technologies that can actually sustain us and sustain life. So my idea is not creating an alternative. I don't know, I think it's horrible what Lisa laid out for us. But that was after decolonization. So that wasn't an alternative. That was built on state sovereignty. State sovereignty becomes the predicate element to be able to create these entities that are businesses that would otherwise be known as the state. And so we are still in that experiment, and I hope that the work that we're doing, we actually figure that out.
Hi, kind of going off of that last question, my name is Sara. Thank you so much for speaking, both of you. I really appreciate all of your commentary so far. My question is about decolonization. So as a non-Palestinian, but a pro-Palestinian supporter, I feel that often I'm kind of given weird faces when I talk about decolonization, that I think it's still possible, which is something that you mentioned earlier. I think that there are so many different voices weighing in on what people see as a quote-unquote solution for the Israel-Palestine problem. And one of my questions to you is, how do we sort of weed out which voices we should be, is there a way to think of all of these different sources of input as ones that are more legitimate, ones that should be listened to more, or are we kind of is your view to like sort of take everyone's opinions, weigh them out, and then come up with your own idea for the future of Palestine more broadly? And how does decolonization sort of fit into that?
Okay, great. Can I use that microphone so I can stop exerting myself so much? Thank you. I drank 2 pots of honey ginger lemon tea today. It's not working. So let me be more specific. Yesterday, there was an organization called NDN, which is an indigenous organization that connects indigenous communities across the world. And they published a report on Land Day that stipulated that in the case of Palestine, decolonization meant the right of return for refugees and giving the land back. Now, in continuing my answer to Ayan, I don't believe that the right of return for refugees is actually the end of the Palestinian struggle. I think it's the beginning, right? Because that's the point at which Palestinians need to imagine what new social and political communities they would create. And that new creation has to include Jewish Israelis that live there, right? So there are these imaginings that have to happen. Right? What does this look like? To think that it ends with the right of return is just to get us to this outcome. Or to the outcome in South Africa. South Africa is a horrible case study. We model it as a North Star, and yet it's the site of extreme xenophobia and inequality. And South Africans themselves understand that their struggle is unfinished. So there is this work. How can Palestinians offer a better future for Israelis than Israel has been able to offer to Israelis? Right? This is imagination work. This is the work of radical imagination. And some Palestinians have tried. Palestinian Israeli political parties have reached across the aisle to create alliances with the Middle Eastern Israeli groups, political parties, but they were rejected. But that would have been a start. What happens when Middle Eastern Jewish Israelis and Palestinians unite based on their identity as Arabs and not Jew versus Palestinian, for example? Or what happens when Afro-Palestinians reach across to make alliances with Afro-Israelis in order to create a future that dismantles anti-Blackness, right? There are ways that we can disrupt the native settler binary to do that work. In terms of who do we listen to? I believe that authority is earned. And so who is responsible, who is accountable, who is connected to movement, for example, and not necessarily who is elected and as a head of state. And then we have to discern who those people are.
Hello, thank you again for speaking. I've been really enjoying this so far. Just in terms of what you were saying about holding people accountable, especially in an international human rights perspective, you mentioned the International Criminal Court, and that sort of got me thinking, Israel isn't technically a member of the International Criminal Court for precisely the reasons that we were speaking about. Another non-member of the International Criminal Court is the US. So just in thinking about that, as someone who's involved in international human rights, how do you suggest that we hold people accountable, especially coming from the West, the global North, where a lot of the times the trend that we see is countries sort of thinking that they can do what they want by not joining these sort of international organizations and not sort of listening to recommendations from places like the UN and not joining things like the ICC.
Did you want to try to? No, go ahead with that. I think the ICC right now is between a rock and a hard place. Because if it doesn't prosecute powerful countries like the United States for its war crimes in Afghanistan, and it doesn't prosecute Israel for its war crimes against Palestinians, then it loses its legitimacy. Because since its establishment in 2002, it's only prosecuted African heads of state and Slobodan Milosevic. On the other hand, if they actually prosecute Israel and the United States, then those are as two very powerful countries who work to sabotage it, not least by withdrawing their funding and legitimacy for it. And we've already seen the Trump administration revoke all visas for the prosecutor, or the former prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, right? So this puts the ICC, and in fact all of international criminal law, on trial. Many critical analysts, like Professor Kamari Maxine Clark, will argue that the Rome Statute of 1998, which led to the establishment of the ICC in 2002, is in fact a document that enshrines white supremacy, not least because the five crimes that are enumerated in the Rome Statute basically absolve colonial powers, and so do not get to any root conflicts, not least of which because Article 17 on complementarity makes it so that states have the first right of jurisdiction to prosecute themselves unless they're unable and unwilling, and it's usually developing states that are unable to prosecute themselves. So the structure of the ICC is proving itself to be very limited, as novel and as lofty and as idealistic and as hopeful as we are that it would work. So then how do we achieve accountability? And the only way that we've achieved accountability, whether it be at Nuremberg, right, or the trial of Milosevic, or the trial of, or the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia, or Rwanda, or Lebanon, the Special Tribunal in Lebanon, or the Special Tribunal in Cambodia, have all been through popular movement. They've not been through legal decree. It's the popular movement that actually leads to the outcome where we've already decided on guilt or innocence before the trial proceeds. Full stop. The Nazi officials, the 26 Nazi officials at Nuremberg never got a trial, right? None of these other officials ever get a fair trial. It's popular movement that makes that decision. And so we get to determine what the outcome is in terms of accountability. It's why I've been so critical of the Palestinian ICC bid. It's so short-sighted. They're putting far too much faith in the ICC. The ICC's claims in the Palestine file will first and foremost find Hamas guilty. And then they might find some individuals guilty, but never for court crimes like apartheid. And yet the Palestinian leadership has failed to mobilize a campaign to find Israel guilty in popular opinion because of an over-reliance and a fetishization of the law. We should not fetishize the law. All of it, even human rights law, even the laws of war, are all, they all are contingent on voluntary compliance. No state is forced to sign anything, and even if they do, they can make legal argumentation why it doesn't apply. When it does apply, it's because historical conditions of popular mobilization, morality, economics, balance of power determine it as such. So we can use the law as a tool, but power actually lies in these movements that determine the outcomes.
May I just add, may I also add the fact that as we have this war on Ukraine, now Americans are talking about the use of the ICC for war crimes against Putin. And yet, when the ICC was trying to investigate the United States for crimes committed in Afghanistan, the United States imposed significant sanctions, on the prosecutor, and was not even allowed to enter. Congress passed laws that if any US official was tried by the ACC and seized by the ACC, will use force to liberate. And that would really tell you about hypocrisy that exists when the United States really talks about advancing the rule of law. in addition, when it comes to the Palestinians have been recognized by the General Assembly as having an observer status, and that gives them the right to join so many international organizations. In that sense, whether you really think it's important or not, we cannot say that they don't have the right if they want to use the ICC. Now, there is lots of criticism that goes against the ICC, but the ICC does not have an Islamic due process or a due process from Africa or from Latin America. This is a Western due process. And if you really don't believe in a Western due process, then whatever, and that's really the problem that the ICC itself has.
Can I remind you all of what Matum said about the law when it's inconvenient can be changed? So just, he's
That's
right.
it. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Anderson, not least of all to give Professor Erakat a break. So there is potentially a smaller, easier one to answer first, and then a second one. So the first question, you referred to the shift in the middle period that exasperated sectarian and other ethnic lines within those countries. But I wonder the extent to which elements like the burgeoning of the rentier state economies of the Gulf, as well as the differentiation one would make between like Qatar and Bahrain with significant minorities versus Egypt, for example, which does have obviously a Christian minority, but that's not the political dynamic that we're talking about. Meaning, how do you take into account the difference that would take place in countries that do have that rentier style of welfare state that can exist versus those that can't, like Lebanon, and then the differentiation between countries with significant majorities or significant multiple minorities, like in Iraq, for example, which is ruled by, or was ruled by a Sunni minority over many other subordinate people, let's call them, for the sake of Saddam's regime. And then the second question was more maybe kind of blending the two presentations, which was if this awful situation exists, especially as you elaborated in particularly the Gulf, but elsewhere, do you believe in the potential for some sort of collectivist movement, similar to what Professor Erakat was just referring to, as able to move that, what's the word I'm looking for, like the dial a little bit, and then create a counter as a collectivist kind of almost corporation to the elite wealth of those kind of islands of wealth and power that you're talking about. And I'm thinking about these both in kind of a Marxist and Weberian sense of the monopoly of violence as it pertains to the control of the means of production that you're referring to as holding in the hands of that specific elite. Do you believe there is actually potential for the alternative to exist in those countries where 80% of the wealth and everything else is in the hands of 1% maybe sometimes? I know those are very different questions, but I thought one easier than the other.
Well, I actually think they're related to some extent, because I think what I'm prepared to argue about the mobilization of various kinds of sectarian identities is that that was a deliberate policy on the part of governments. And some governments saw themselves, confronted with a variety of potential identities that made it easier to mobilize, but that didn't mean that other governments didn't do that. So I think just take Egypt. This is a pretty cliched picture, but it doesn't seem entirely wrong to me. Sadat decides that he's going to authorize Islamist behavior. Within several years, it gets out of hand, and then suddenly it seems like it's sort of popular. But if he hadn't done that, if he had said, we're going to be Nasserist all the way through, then I think that would have been a different future for him, or so forth. So I think these governments were deliberately trying to create identities that they thought they could control and that they thought would be their clienteles, and they were wrong about being able to control them. And once they were out of control, then they confronted opposition organized that way. In many ways, opposition organized that way during the regime's period, and now in my sort of business enterprise period, is actually much better opposition, if you have to have some, than class-based opposition, right? Because then, so that gets to your second part of your question. Unless we start thinking of ourselves collectively in class terms, to use, however we describe that ultimately, I don't care about the terminology. And, in the United States today, talking about class seems like so retro. But really, if we don't start thinking about the kind of dynamic of popular, whatever you want to call it, empowerment, whether it's through class struggle or some other, then I think they have won. So why do I think that's a real challenge right now? Partly because of this sort of accretion of historical identities that divide people in ways that are very useful to those who are privileged. But I also think, and this is why I don't think Marx and Weber work for us completely, is I do think we're in an era of surveillance capitalism that is just incredibly powerful. So the extent to which you can actually organize at the popular level autonomously without having all of that instantaneously transferred to the authorities is pretty limited now. So that's what so part of it is that I think the picture I've drawn is to try and draw attention to how disproportionate the power is right now. These enclaves have most of the money, most of the wealth, most of the surveillance capacity, most of the use of violence. How do we confront that? I don't think it's easy to confront it if you don't acknowledge it. So that's kind of where I'm trying to get us to go. But then I say, yes, then we have to be pretty imaginative if we don't think that this is the way the world should look. And we're not there yet. We don't have the marks of the moment, in my estimation. But I would love some Marxes to arise from this conversation.
Okay, we'll take a couple of more questions and please. Yes.
I'm going to let first, then I'll ask my question. Is that okay?
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you guys so much for sharing your wisdom. My question is about police states. So you both sort of mentioned the consolidation of police states in the Middle East. And within that, we're seeing the criminalization and repression of solidarity with Palestine in countries like Egypt and countries like Jordan. I'm thinking about the police response to the solidarity protests in Jordan. I'm thinking about the Egyptian Palestinian activist Rami Shath being forced to revoke his citizenship for his freedom. So in light of this dynamic, do you think that liberation in these countries can come to fruition without a liberated Palestine?
Oh, great question.
I guess I'm asking my question on top of that question. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. Okay, hi everybody. Hi Lisa, and hi Noura, who I haven't met in person yet. I'm Eve Trout-Powell, and I just want to follow up on Sarah's question, which I thought was a really good one, which is how do people use their history here? Because history is so contested. And I'm thinking in particular, Lisa, of Rosie Bashir's new book, Archive Wars, and sort of how in Saudi Arabia people are actually hiding their archives from the government and from, sort of governmental attempts to unify a certain kind of Saudi history that encompasses all of Arabia, although that's only a small part of the history of the Arabian Peninsula. And I'm thinking too, Noura, of what you said about there were these missed opportunities, which I hadn't really thought of in the way you're thinking about them, these missed opportunities for Palestinians to sort of promote statehood at moments of, in the late 50s and the early 60s, I think you're talking about. And then again, after the second Intifada, if I have written it. And so I'm just thinking like how important it is for people to pull together their history, but how do they do it in these kinds of circumstances?
Yeah. This your mic?
But listen to me, you sound horrible. Go ahead. You should. Okay, I'll go first. My short answer to you is actually no. And I do think that all peoples have an entwined history and an entwined future. So there cannot be freedom, obviously, for Palestinians when these other states, as we've seen, are repressing their populations. I mean, Bahrain literally blew up the Pearl Roundabout in order to prevent protests from continuing. We see ongoing counter-revolution in Egypt. You mentioned Rami Shaath, but there's Ala Abdel Fattah and multiple others, and there's a fear of speaking and an exodus. There is, what you describe in Jordan, now this turn in the police state to suppress protests, when historically these regimes have used the struggle for Palestine opportunistically in order to deflect criticism for themselves. So I don't think that there's necessarily a shift amongst the sincerity of the regimes as much as there's a shift in tactics of how to consolidate their control and protect it. But I also want to point out, because I don't want to miss this opportunity, that we too, the United States, has very much what could be described as a police state and what is increasing police militarization that's entwined also in the US's colonial geography beginning in the late 19th century when it defeats the Spanish and becomes the colonial power in the Philippines, in Guam, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, that at this turn, we see as the military begins to professionalize itself in order to maintain these colonial holdings, that the police reform movement that's happening in the US is mirroring these developments. And so when we see the suppression of Black uprising, which the US considers as insurgency, I just want us to be able to see this universal nature that isn't particular just to really bad Arabs who haven't figured out democracy, and that our liberation is entwined. Our liberation is entwined. I don't have the answer. It's so good to see you. Congratulations, Madam President. Lisa.
Actually, condolences.
Well, thank you for taking on that burden on our behalf. And the idea of how do we resurrect our history for ourselves? Well, I want to, and obviously big ups to Rosie, but also point that there has been an increasing movement in the tradition of Rosemary Saïr and others of studying a non-elite Palestinian history in order to resurrect, right, a different kind of trajectory that we might have missed, right? The history of peasants, the history of women, the history of other smaller communities that are now, I think, historians are pursuing, young historians like Tariq Radi, Noor Juda, and senior historians like Shireen Say Ali, who are lifting for us in order to be able to imagine something beyond the Nashashibis and the Husseinis as models of power, but instead the alternatives that, for example, Akram Dwaykat, who was the young revolutionary in the Great Revolt, might present to us. So I believe in that, and I think we have so much to learn still.
Yeah, I would only add that I think that's not only history. There's a sort of everyday politics and a way of looking at, how people are living their lives that I think is also potentially very fruitful.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to say one word, for your policing. You have to understand that in many Arab and Muslim countries, in many third world countries, criminal law is a social and economic program. That's how they really look at punishment. So we're coming to the end of this session. I would like, on your behalf, to thank our great speakers and thank you for attending.